She's definitely talking the talk, isn't she? She's talking about we have precise plans now to send European troops to Ukraine, as if this was her army. Hello, this is the Brussels Signal Studio. I'm Justin. Online we have Alex in the good old UK, and we're here to talk about defence, European defence and war and all that kind of stuff. And Alex, let me start off with the proposition that people are living in a fantasy world, because we have von der Leyen, Madame von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, saying again that Europe's going to send troops. So there is this huge European defence budget, which people are saying actually it's nonsense. I mean, what's going on in your opinion? Is there going to be a European army? Are we getting into this war? What's going on?
Well, they had a dream of creating a European army and then the joint sort of forces command, things like PESCO. The EU push ahead with their socialist projects all the time, use any crisis in which to try and power grab. But in terms of military spending across Europe, we have a situation where most European economies are in dire straits. The defence budgets that have been spent, and Ursula von der Leyen knows this personally, have not been spent wisely at all. And the idea that we're armed and equipped and ready to run to Ukraine's defence, as reading the other day in France, they've been told they've got to be prepared for war on their own soil. But most European countries, essentially at this stage, seem to be fighting their leadership and fighting themselves over big issues such as mass migration.
Right, so always talk about war with Russia then is nonsense, is it?
Well, is it? I don't know. I don't think we can be ever so sure. But one thing we do know about our opponents is they play four-dimensional chess, and they're very, very slow and they're very gradual. And you saw this big display of might at this Global South Summit that President Xi Jinping hosted the other day, flanked by the leaders of North Korea and Russia. In attendance, of course, was Narendra Modi of India, always opportunistically playing both sides. But they were very clear in what they were saying, which is the New World Order is the global south, and we're going to pool together resources economically, militarily, and the way that power is broken on the world stage is going to be very different. And you look at what's going on in Europe, you look at the hand-wringing and the dithering when it comes to the response to Ukraine. You look at the inability to manage their own economies and societies. You look at the fact that they've allowed themselves to be taken over by so much psyop and grey zone warfare emanating from hostile states. And you have to, ask yourself, are we able to do this? Could we do anything if America leave the playing field? And increasingly, again, you're seeing America with an outlook towards the situation in Europe that's a little bit behind the times, that hasn't really fully yet understood the threats that countries like Russia are actually posing.
And how about General von der Leyen there? She was out in her plane touring Eastern Europe, and evidently the Russians tried to jam her GPS, or at least that's what her PR people said. Evidently that turns out to be fake news. Her plane, nobody cared about where she went and where she was coming from. But she's definitely talking the talk, isn't she? She's talking about we have precise plans now to send European troops to Ukraine, as if this was her army.
Well, she is a bit of a megalomaniac, but also wasn't she one of Germany's worst defence ministers in history? I wouldn't really fancy her role. I certainly don't fancy her doing it, but unfortunately that's what we've got. But what we've heard from European nations is a lot of bluster. It's all been rhetoric. It's all been, we're going to do this. We must fight to save Ukraine. We're going to impose swingeing sanctions on Russia. And they never really do. It's always just about enough or a little bit too late. There's not been any decisive action since the invasion of Ukraine. Putin's essentially calling the shots. He has been as well with America. He's now stuck in a strange dynamic where if he cuts off the war and stops funding the war machine and the sort of military industrial profile, his own economy is going to be in a big mess. I don't think he wants to walk away. He's not being pushed around. And the Europeans don't seem to have any real answers to this problem.
Gabriel, let's bring you in here. Gabriel is our defence expert and Brussels Signal columnist. I mean, you've written a lot about these pie-in-the-sky numbers and fake defence budgets. So are we living in cloud cuckoo land?
Thanks, Justin. This is a fascinating conversation. It's very entertaining and a lot of truth in what's been said so far. But there's also some nuances that we need to insert here. So it's it's true that the Europeans are not a military force capable on their own to take on Russia. Of course, this question of any kind of war with Russia, it's really a NATO question, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. That involves the question of how much we can still rely on the Americans. Obviously, America is the real sort of power in NATO. NATO depends on that American security support for Europe, especially through the nuclear dimension, which is fundamental to all of this. The Europeans, so the EU through Ursula von der Leyen, they have put forward some really sort of exaggerated numbers in terms of what they want to do on defense spending. She talked about publicly about 800 billion for European defense, which is a rather misleading number because that's arrived at by counting 150 billion in European loans that the European Commission will be borrowing from the international markets and allowing individual countries to use that debt to support their defense rearmament. And so that's one part of the 800 billion, and the rest of it is just an estimated figure of what could of what the EU member states could spend by 2030 if they actually all met the NATO defense target. And this is the question, and it goes back to what Alex was saying, is that Europe has a very big economic problem. All these individual countries, I mean, not all of them, but most of them, they're in dire straits economically. So where are they going to actually find the money to reach the 3.5 defense military defense, so military spending target for NATO that was agreed at the last NATO summit, plus the 1.5 of GDP target, also a NATO target for other types of security and resilience and critical national infrastructure spending, right? So that those are very big numbers. The 3.5 defense spending target, that's until 2035, so that's a very it's 10 years away. It's a very aspirational figure, so we'll see who actually makes it there. Some countries are more willing to make sacrifices, as in to sacrifice their taxpayers' money to fund all this defense stuff, than others. So obviously Germany. So Germany has much more fiscal room to borrow than other countries because its national debt is like 80% or something like that. So it can borrow more, and this is what Chancellor Merz has said that he will be doing. And they are raising the defense budget in Germany quite a lot. So Justin, not you, Justin. I was just going to say that just
Me.
in 2020, they were spending last year. They were spending about 52 billion euros on defense in Germany. This year is already about 80, and it's going to over 100 billion next year. And they're bringing in new borrowing, as I said, on the German side. They also have the special defense fund that Chancellor Scholz set up, if you remember, just after the invasion in 2022. So they're spending about like over 20 billion per year from that fund as well. So there is an accelerated German investment in all this. But I think that the big point here is that the scale of what is required is so huge that even these kinds of investments are not enough. I think that's the difficulty with the situation like this war in Ukraine. It's hard to quite grasp the scale on which a war like this is being fought. I mean, remember, this is a war
Right.
fought on
Yeah.
a 1,000-kilometer front. Each side has, over 100 brigades in the field, roughly. in terms of personnel. The entire European side of NATO, so the European allies of NATO, Europe basically, excepting Turkey, on paper they've got about 113 brigades. So if you look at the official military balance report from the think tank International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is the most authoritative source on this. So if you count all the brigades in Europe, you've got about 113 brigades. That includes units from countries like Albania or Portugal, which are, they're not actually going to be sent to fight in the Russians on the Eastern Front, are they?
So basically, we're screwed. We get the picture, Gabriel. I mean, in the meantime, we're still dependent on Daddy. Now, the Daddy, of course, is not my quote. That's from Mark Rutte, who's the Secretary General of NATO, and we know who he's referring to, don't we? Daddy. That would be President Trump, who is also behind this spend more order, and that's it. Basically, if Daddy goes away, Europe is at the mercy of whatever Russia wants to do.
I think. Yeah, I mean, and that's true. If that happens, the situation will be very, very difficult. That doesn't mean that the Russians will automatically come over the border and roll through Europe.
But that's not what. Yeah, fair point. But that's not what Mr. Rutte said. Did you hear that? You remember this, Alice? Just before the summer, he told the Brits, spend more or learn to speak Russian. How did that one go down?
There's been a lot of hyperbole, hasn't there, about this idea that Russia is going to come into Western Europe. But we do know that Russia is playing with us. We know that Russia is buzzing the UK shorelines with their aircraft and sending submarines into the territories of European nations. That Russia's up to all sorts of things. And largely the fight we seem to have in Russia, particularly in Western Europe, is the grey zone warfare. It's all the other things. It's misinformation campaigns. It's bot farms. It's arson attacks on our own soil. It is assassinations of citizens on UK soil. These are the sort of things, and even arguably, I would say, when you look at the operations of the renamed Wagner mercenaries or Africa Corps down in Africa, the Russian sort of Kremlin military apparatchiks, they are helping to destabilize these mass migratory flows out of Africa into Europe. We've already seen Russia busing migrants through Belarus to the borders of Poland. So we know actually that the way that we're being attacked isn't necessarily just conventionally and militarily, and they are sort of, sending little threatening signs. But for a long time now, they have been eroding a sense of nationhood. They've been interfering in elections. They have been things like enhancing and exaggerating this mad sort of leftist activism that is broken out all across Europe, which has kept us preoccupied. We've ended up nations that seem to be deeply indebted with mass migratory flows and a lack of social cohesion. And it's not just Russia doing this. There are other nations, such as China, who are part of this, using things such as TikTok, for example. But we are being hollowed out and weakened from the inside. And sadly to say, what I have realised is too many of our European leaders have been party to this. They're the ones who have abandoned things like sensible energy policy. They're the ones who have cut the size of the armed forces. They're the ones who have been totally politically naive when it comes to bilateral relationships with other countries. They're the ones that are impoverishing their own citizens with increasingly socialist agendas. And so we've now become a sort of hollowed out from the inside continent with weakened armed forces. And our leaders, frankly, seem to be clueless as to how to solve these problems. And so you're seeing political revolutions really bubble up now across the continent, with citizens turning to more right-wing politicians and re-embracing the idea of nationhood. And what's interesting when we talk about America is that's been a big demand that's come from not just Donald Trump, but J.D. Vance. He said to Europe, listen, you've got to invest more in defense. You've got to stand up for yourselves. We can't always come to your rescue, but you've got to stop being weird, stop being woke, stop this mass immigration, believe in your people, treat them properly, build your economies, embrace fossil fuels. The message from America is, Europe, you're on a suicide mission.
Well, Gabriel, I get they call this hybrid warfare, don't they? Russia won't need to roll across the hills if Europe collapses from within.
Uh, yes, if that if that's the case, I still think the old expression that there is a lot of ruin in a nation. I think that still holds. So I actually think that the collapse of Europe, even on the current trends, is not really that imminent. I mean, I'm afraid that the current situation can drag on for the current decay and decline can drag on for quite a long time yet. I think the main point about the threat of a Russian invasion, the main fallacy over that, is the question of um, whether the Russians can do that while still fighting the war in Ukraine. I mean, any invasion of Europe will necessarily have to happen if the Russians really want to do that. And there's a whole debate to be had over whether they actually have an interest in invading Europe. They can only do that after sort of dealing with Ukraine. They can't open a two-front war, as it were. That is absolutely sort of impossible, reckless, and it won't lead anywhere, and they don't have the actual capabilities to do that. The vast majority of Russian military power is now invested in Ukraine. So, and that's actually, the main rationale for Europe to support Ukraine so much as they've done so far.
Yeah, let the Russians wear themselves
Yeah,
out in
that's the
Ukraine
idea.
so they
Yeah,
can't take another
yeah,
target.
that we sort of wear down the Russians in Ukraine, we erode Russian military power in Ukraine, and that's where the fight is, and that's how we deal with this. Of course, the problem with that is that Russia is only getting stronger, even as as it fights the war in Ukraine, rather than weaker.
Well, stronger, how so? What do you mean? Training more men, conscripting more men, or improving its technologies? What do you mean?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. So it's obviously mobilized its entire defense in its entire economy. It's become a war economy. So it's optimized and scaled up massively its military production. It has expanded its armed forces. It's already got a target of expanding it to 1.5 million. So that was a target set in 2023 by the previous defense minister Shoigu, and they're working towards that. That will add another 300,000 men to their permanent defense establishments. That's a lot of troops, and they are just modernizing the force. So a lot of much of this war so far has been fought by the Russians by using their Cold War stocks of ammunition, of various other weapon systems and fighting equipment. And as they have been burning through those, they are replacing them with modern equipment. So they are becoming a much more a powerful force and also more experienced. So the experience of fighting is absolutely critical here. In any future scenario of a war with Russia, the Europeans won't have that experience. The
Gabriel,
Russians will.
do women fight on the front line? I remember in the Second World War, women took a real frontline role, did they not? Have we seen any of that in the current conflict?
Well, we've certainly seen it on the Ukrainian side, and there's a great deal of bravery, obviously, on the Ukrainian side, and including women, including like somewhat uh, I don't know, extraordinarily pregnant women. I mean, there have been stories about how pregnant women have been on the front lines and fighting for Ukraine. I mean, I don't know whether that's how extensive that practice is, but I haven't, to be honest, I personally haven't seen too much footage of women fighting on the Russian side on the front line.
I remember they were feared, weren't there? There were some of the women were feared during the Second World War. They were among the most ferocious fighters, right?
Yeah, I mean that's another point to make here. This is a good point, Justin. That Russia is not actually fully mobilized for war in a societal sense. Remember, Putin is still fighting this war under the label of a special military operation. So, from a sort of legal point of view, Putin has not put the entire society on a war footing. When you do that, new powers are activated on the state. They can sort of conscript people and so on. And it's all, so far, it's fighting. The Russians are fighting with volunteer troops. So they are recruiting people who come forward voluntarily, about 30,000 per month. And so that's another important aspect to this confrontation, is that actually Russia has, in my view, and other people's view, it actually does have many more reserves, many more parts for further escalation in this conflict.
Right, we know as well, don't we? There, you've been using citizens of other countries. North Koreans have allegedly gone out to join the war effort, and prisoners from other nations. So Russia seems quite able as well to draw in manpower resources from beyond their own borders.
Let's move on. Under the radar, there is an issue I know, Alex, that you're a specialist in, that here on the continent, few people have heard of. It hasn't been covered widely here on the continent, and that is the arrest of this comedian. I think he's Irish, isn't he? Tell us about that, please.
Right, he's called Graham Linehan, and he has for a long time. He was the scriptwriter and the creator of the Irish comedy series about priests on an island called Father Ted, a brilliant series it was as well back in the 90s. But he has for a long time, he's a gay man himself, but he's been an outspoken advocate against the trans activism, saying that men shouldn't compete in women's sports, men shouldn't be allowed to go into women's changing rooms and toilets. And he has written various tweets to this end, on the side of J.K. Rowling, of course. But he was aboard the other day and was coming back via Heathrow Airport. When his plane touched down, he was arrested by 5 armed police straight off the aeroplane, dragged into detention. And it was all about a tweet that he wrote back in April, which basically said, if a man comes into your toilets, ladies, punch him in the balls. But he's been arrested on incitement to violence. It's created a huge outcry in the United Kingdom, but it's not the first time that something like this has happened. This is now taking place regularly in the United Kingdom. Anyone who seems to espouse a right-wing view is being dragged into a police station. There's even an example of police turning up at somebody's front door because in a WhatsApp group they'd criticised their school. We've had police turn up at the door of the journalist Alison Pearson, a very renowned columnist for the Daily Telegraph newspaper, based upon someone alleging a hate crime against her. There are hate crime reporting centres dotted around Scotland. And we are now in a situation, we of course also had the arrest and incarceration, a 31-month sentence handed to Lucy Connolly when she had said just after the Southport riots about the migrant hotels, burn them down for all that I care. Which for me, you add the caveat for all that I care, and you know that this is a tongue-in-cheek comment. And yet at the same time, we have jihadists marching the streets every weekend, calling for global intifada, and nothing's done. Pro-Palestine flags and Hamas flags and things like that being hung around in London boroughs. And there's been this fight back now from the British people called Operation Raise the Colours, where Brits have been going up and down the country, sticking the Cross of St George or the Union flag on lampposts and on bridges to say we will not be silenced. There's been crackdowns against protesters outside migrant hotels. Britain at the moment looks like a dystopian nightmare, but the issues around free speech are very chilling and very, very real. And Nigel Farage went over to the United States yesterday to present to them the issues in Britain. This has been raised before. JD Vance has brought it up in the very first meeting of Sir Keir Starmer in the Oval Office. It was brought up again when JD Vance came over here for his holidays and hung out with our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. And the response we get every time from Sir Keir Starmer is, we uphold free speech, we believe in free speech. But we know that the reality of the situation in the United Kingdom is that is not the case. And it's his leftist lawyer cabals, people like the unelected, appointed Attorney General, who is a Marxist revolutionary, and his cohort of judges, who are basically acting at the behest of the Prime Minister in order to try and curtail any sort of right-wing rhetoric. So in the UK, there is a real sense of harrowing terror now as to what you can say if you're a journalist, if you're a presenter like me, but mainly for the ordinary citizen, because it's men and women who are working as teachers and childminders, who especially are the ones being arrested or having the police turned up by something they have said on social media. It's a very, very bad state of affairs indeed.
Gabriel, do you think this has potential for spreading across the European Union, or is this a UK issue?
We're certainly not just a UK issue. I mean, we've seen so many abuses across Europe. The one that really sort of struck me, and I'm sure struck everyone, in terms of democratic norms and sort of fundamental liberties being trampled, was of course the cancellation of elections in Romania in December.
Ah.
So not only that we've got these sort of censorship of free speech across Europe, but it goes even beyond that to what it has always been considered the fundamental element of democracy, which is the right to free elections, to a free vote. So I think we're now looking at the entire spectrum of liberties that used to be understood as the foundations of democracy now being challenged and denied, really. And it's not just you don't need to have an extensive practice of this happening. It's that once you have broken this principle and you've crossed certain lines, that already is a point of no return. I mean, it really depresses confidence in democracy, really deals democracy a massive blow. Of course, such actions like the arrest of Linehan on the airport are intended as a deterrent against others who might want to, speak their mind. Imagine that, on various things, right? So it's not that it's the fact that it doesn't happen en masse is not something that we should feel reassured by. The fact that it's happened just once is enough to be absolutely terrifying.
Right, democracy in decline sounds like a good idea for a Brussels Signal documentary. I'm looking at Anne Law over there in the corner. Anyway, that's all we have time for, other than the interference special section, which we call Heroes and Zeros, where we pick a hero and a zero of the current news cycle. Who we're going to go for? Alex.
Well, my hero has got to be Nigel Farage for going and blowing the whistle at the terrible state of affairs in the United Kingdom when it comes to free speech, going over to America and dobbing in Sir Keir Starmer. I hope ahead of Trump's state visit coming up in a couple of weeks' time that the message is going to be loud and clear in America. We want your intervention. We need your intervention.
How about a zero, Gabriel?
There's so many of them. I believe that probably Chancellor Merz, who found fit this week to make a statement to the effect that Putin is a war criminal and all these things, and there must be absolutely no compromise, and so on. And it's not that the statement, according to the existing international law that is recognized officially by various governments, that is not that's not true. Even we might not agree with that interpretation and so on. But the problem with this statement at this point in time, when there are negotiations ongoing with Russia, is that is just undermining those negotiations. And I think everyone who actually wants to see some sort of peace arrived at through negotiations in Ukraine needs to be quite careful with their statements at this point in time. So we need more diplomacy rather than more, provocation.
Well, there we go. A hero, Mr. Farage, and zero Chancellor Merz. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. That was Interference, and that is my hand jive. And this is, in fact, episode 1 of the new season. Thanks a lot, Alex, as always. Thanks to Gabriel for coming to join us. See you next time.